everybody, and welcome to the Ether Podcast. I am Rodrigo, and I'm joined by my good friends, Pequeño Juan, who at the moment is impersonating Musketeers on the weekend, uh, Alberto Figueroa, who, as I've mentioned before, he is the most best looking and the most successful amongst all of us, and lastly is Nathan Figueroa, uh, our friend and friendly neighborhood lawyer. Uh, who is here to make sure that we don't get in trouble in any way with the law.
Saul Goodman.
It is.
Call me,
Today,
baby.
we are continuing our series on the kingdom of God. Just to give a quick recap to our audience on what we've talked about so far, we have talked about the first episode that we did on this podcast series was about sort of some of the reasons we explored some of the reasons as to why we tend to misunderstand the kingdom, and then we talked about what is the kingdom. So we began by sort of clarifying some things about the kingdom of God, and then we delved deep into what is the kingdom. Like when we talk about the kingdom of God, what is it that we're talking about? And one of the things that we mentioned, we try to give the kingdom a definition. And basically, what we came up with is that the kingdom of God is a place where God dwells and his king seat sits, and where his people try to spread his blessings to the rest of the world. And we talked about that. And today, we are talking about the king of the kingdom. Now, this is not going to come as a surprise to many, but Jesus is supposed to be the king of the kingdom. And I think most Christians understand that. Most people, I think, understand that. Most people sort of understand um, that Jesus sort of came as this really important figure in Christianity and all of that stuff. But all that being said, I think many of us, just like with the kingdom of God, many of us tend to overlook or not really understand what having King Jesus as our King means for our lives. And so today I want to talk about sort of what does it mean for Jesus to be the King of our lives? What is it supposed to mean? And I also want to talk about what kind of king he is, and also in turn talk about what kind of kingdom he rules over, because I think those are three very important discussion points. And let me begin by saying this: one of probably the biggest mental and emotional changes that I have had to make as I've studied the kingdom of God in depth is really understanding what having a king over me is supposed to mean. And I think this is especially important, an important question given the moment that we are living as a society. Even though we're now past an election, politics still looms large in our world, and there's still a lot of things that are sort of in flux. And there's a lot of, I think, conversations that really revolve around power and political doctrine. And in the middle of all of that, the name of Christianity gets thrown into that quite a bit. And I think it's especially important just um, from an everyday understanding again of what it means to have a king, what it means to for Jesus to be the king of our lives. And I do think that it's important for us to understand also that God always intended to send a king. Like he intended for his people to have a king. And I think uh part of the difficulty is that we don't have never, like, the four of us, even though I think all of us are kind of immigrants here actually. Like I'm a naturalized American. The three of you, Johnny wasn't born here, but he has an American father. Beto, were you born here?
I was not.
Oh, Beto also wasn't born here, but you have
Oof.
an American mom. And Nathan, his parents are Filipino immigrants, but you were born here in the United States,
I
right?
was. I'm an American.
Right. But I say all that to say basically that none of us, even though we're not from here, we've never had kings over our heads.
Mhm.
And like again, understanding what it means to have a king. And I think the biggest thing that I would like to communicate about having a king is the fact that the king is everything. Like in a kingdom, the word and the say of the king is above all, and it's also final. Like what the king says goes. And again, I think the part of the problem is that a lot of Christians either A, don't fully understand a lot of the things that Jesus said, and B, even though they would call him king, even though they would call him the Christ, doesn't necessarily live as though he was a king. And so I guess again, part of what I want to discuss is yes, he's the king, and he came to do a very specific job as a king. But before we get into that, I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on what does it mean for Jesus to be king of your lives?
When I think about him being king, it's part and parcel with this, this other idea that I wrestle with, because like even biblically, God and Jesus separately and together at different times, they're just described as like wearing many hats, right? There's father, there's friend. Jesus uses filial terms, brother, sister, things like that. And so like, it's just because there's so many like facets to these Godhead figures. It's hard to keep all those things in mind, but a lot of people will pick and choose which kind of relationship they want to have with God and with Jesus, right? So some people will see God as like, father, like this is my father, this is my dad. Some people will see God and Jesus as a friend. This is a friend that I can trust with everything in my life and do all these things. And I couldn't necessarily fault them for that, because it's hard to like have all those relationships with God, and with Jesus, but the relationship of king is important. I think it's really, really important, especially as people become more and more comfortable and they get a little long in the tooth in their faith, to let go of that. I actually find that there's kind of like this kind of progression where early on it's like, wow, amazing. And then you kind of get complacent. And then the older Christians I know like really go back to this kinghood status, which is really cool. But with king, it talks...
Listening to this, as this is a auditory medium, the gesture that Nathan just made is like a U.
Yeah, a reverse bell curve, as they say, a valley, and it's just this idea of fear, like this biblical fear. I think a little bit, and biblical fear is so interesting. Like there's passages where it'll use the word fear and afraid in the same passage, but they mean different things, right? How love drives out fear, or being afraid, but it's just this level of reverence and respect. Right? You don't look at a king and say, today, maybe I don't follow your rule. It's a king, right? It's just a different relationship. And I think it's an important relationship to continue to maintain the idea, and especially because the Bible is so clear that this is the relationship, because it changes things. Because for me, at many times, I view it as like, hey, this is more of like a suggestion, like a suggested code of conduct, as opposed to like, these are the laws of a king. And a king, by the way, that I want to follow. This isn't restrictive law. It isn't oppressive law. It's laws that are designed to protect me and protect the people that are in the kingdom, and even protect people that are outside of the kingdom in many ways. So I think it's important, because people can look at their relationship with God many different ways that are all biblically accurate. But the relationship of king puts a lot of weight and puts a little bit of that reverence and that fear back into this relationship of like, yes, you are a loving, benevolent, kind, forgiving, gracious king, but king nonetheless. And I willingly subject myself and submit myself to your kingdom, your kingship, your reign and rule.
That's well said. I think my understanding of God's kingdom has been shaped by my understanding of these patriarchal societies that they used to live in, whether it be a king overseeing a nation like Egypt, this large flourishing nation, or whether it be those smaller communities that are shaped by families where you have like the patriarch who would be at the center of those communities. and they all kind of function in the same way, where the patriarch of that society, or the king of that kingdom, was responsible for providing the needs for everybody, and he was responsible for making sure everyone was taken care of. Everyone had food, everyone had shelter, everyone had clothes, everyone had a proper way to live. And because you were being taken care of as a member of that community, you were kind of compelled to kind of live your life for that person's,
Right.
I don't know, for that person's glory, I guess.
And compelled in multiple ways, not compelled as in like I have to because you provide anything.
Yeah.
Like back then, it was very much a like respect. You're a leader. You provide for us. You protect us. Like I want to follow your way. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. You were kind of building up their image, and so your life wasn't really kind of to build up your own success. It wasn't to build up your own, I guess, value necessarily, but you were building up the value of the person who was providing for you, who was taking care of you, who was providing protection for you, and all the person who gave you everything that you needed. So there was this kind of mutual relationship. You know what I mean? It's almost like they both needed each other to flourish. But there were clear cut roles in that relationship. You know what I mean? So it goes a lot with what Nathan was saying, is there isn't ever a point in which you decide like, yeah, like today I don't feel like it, because the king doesn't decide today I don't feel like taking care of you.
Right.
Now, obviously they could do that. And if they did that, like, I mean, you could cause a huge rift in your society. And because of that, there were kings who would be taken out, and there would be uprisings and things like that. And people would revolt because that king is not, he's oppressing a certain group of people. And those people, eventually get tired of that and that sort of a thing. So I view God being the king, or Jesus being the king, in that way. But obviously it's meant to be in this perfect setting where this king is not going to let you down. He will always fulfill his end of, the commitment in the relationship. So it's really up to us, will we hold up our end?
Yeah.
And I'll share. I think my thoughts align, and I came across a psalm recently that stood out to me, and I think is relevant to what you guys are sharing. It says, Psalm 20, "May the Lord answer you when you are in distress. May the name of God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary, grant you support from Zion. May he remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings." And I'll just skip down a little bit. "Now this I know, the Lord gives victory to his anointed." Down to the end, "Lord, give victory to the king. Answer us when we call." And what stood out to me was like this expression that's being done here of like, let it go well with this king.
Yeah.
Because if it goes well with him, like all that we have like hinges on him.
Yeah.
And like the absolute dependence on him. And when I think about like kingdom, a lot of it is renewing and refreshing like our main values. And I think surrendering our own reign and us surrendering, like not being king of our own life, and I think coming to realize that like the reality is someone is going to be king in our life.
True.
We're going to be under some kingdom. There's no way to escape that. But I think it's coming to a place of, okay, if someone's going to rule over me, let it be the absolute best person that is absolutely worthy, and let that person like make it, have victory. Because like if he has victory and I'm totally in allegiance to him, then I have victory.
Yeah. True. It's interesting. All of you pointed to something that I think is super important to mention, is in that when it comes to a king, it's like the king has such influence has such influence over everything that happens, right? If the king is a good administrator, then
Right.
the kingdom is going to flourish. If the
Yeah.
kingdom is a peaceful king, I mean, if the king is a peaceful king, then the kingdom will be peaceful. If the king is an oppressive, arrogant, power hungry person, then the kingdom will suffer. Like
Yeah.
one of the things that I think that is super important for us to understand is that if you are going to have a king, and if you are going to say that Jesus is your king, then what you're saying is that this one person is going to have very felt and very real implications on your life.
Hmm.
And because of that, I think it is super important that we understand, especially from an Old Testament perspective, of what Jesus was being sent to do and how he was expected to rule. Because one of the awesome things, right, is that most people back in ancient times didn't get to choose their king. Like your king was the guy you were born under. And one of the amazing things about Christianity is that you are making a choice of king. And I have never felt, and again, this is in the context of me really doing a deep dive over the past year and a half of what the kingdom of God is, and in terms of who the king of that kingdom is. I have never felt more at peace and more excited about Jesus being my king than I have recently, because I've just really enriched my understanding of the kind of king that he's supposed to be. And I just want to read you a few passages here, and I think we've read some of these before. First one being in Psalm 2, uh, because there's sort of two themes, if you will. That there's a lot said about the king, but I feel like generally speaking, you could break all of the things that are said about the king into two big categories, right? One pertaining to justice, and the other pertaining to and pointing towards a very unusual king. So let me read some of these scriptures to you guys. It says, this is Psalm 2. It says, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell you of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them. I lost my place. I'm sorry. There we go. And dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way of his wrath, and is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. And so it's interesting because what you guys shared both, the three of you shared, is all in this scripture that I just read, in that there is sort of this respect and this reverence that we ought to have towards this king, but also he is a king of justice and blessings. Like he is coming to bring good things. And one of the things that I think that is super important for us to understand is that the justice that Jesus was supposed to bring was a good kind of justice. It wasn't this oppressive, hard, just like break your back justice. And I want to read this as well. This is in Isaiah 42. It says, behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burned wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring justice forth. He will not grow faint or be discouraged. He has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. And what I love about this is that, again, even this scripture makes it very clear, right? That the king that God is going to send, that Jesus is going to be a king of justice, but it's not this like back breaking justice. Like he talks about how he's not gonna shout in the street, and he's not gonna, uh, you know, uh, make a wick like a fire just go out. Like he is going to come in sort of a spirit of gentleness, basically. And I think both of those, all of those things together, some of which may seem contradictory, because Psalm 2 makes it seem like he's going to come and he's going to come with a rod of iron. And the rod of iron was sort of a symbol of authority and power, right? And so he's going to come with all this power, and people should fear him. And Psalm 2 talks about how people should bow to this king because they don't want to make him mad. But also how people are going to be blessed by the blessings of this king. And then Isaiah 42 talks about how he is a king of justice, but he's going to bring that justice forth in a very gentle way. And so there's all these ideas, like the one of fear, the one of respect, and the one of justice, and at the same time, the one of gentleness, that sort of make up this portrait of this king that is very unusual. And at the same time, like this is the king that people expected to have. And
Yeah.
is the king that we ended up with. And as I mentioned before, it's interesting because you want a king to be just. Like you want a king that is going to dispense justice in the right way. And at the same time, you want a king, right, that is not going to be um, violent with that justice. And you also want a king that's going to bring good things to your life, right? And Jesus is all of those kings. He is that king that sort of brings all of those things into one. And again, I think that should really excite us. Like that should really make us go like, man, our king is an awesome king.
Yeah. When speaks of justice, I mean, the justice that he's talking about like he's kind of bringing all humans to like a level ground, like understanding that there is oppression, understanding that there's a lot of distortion, and what he's doing is he's kind of making things equal and fair, making sure everyone's taken care of, right? Like all this image is kind of meant to be put alongside the image of like the kingdoms that are at work in their time,
Yes.
where people are seeing all the, you know, destruction that is happening in different, you know, people groups, right? So that's the kind of justice that he's talking about, from what I understand. And that alone changes how I understand justice.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of times I think of justice as like he is like punishing those for punishing those for doing wrong. Like that's not even the kind of justice that he's talking about. But the other thing that I was thinking about, as you guys talk about fear, as you guys talk about like yeah, just all of that, and maybe like what he brings to those who are doing kingdom differently. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but could one say that like this idea of fear isn't that like he's going to punish us and that he's going to like break us down, but it's more like fear of kingdom without him? Because like I think of Psalm chapter 1, for instance. I'm glad you brought Psalm chapter 2, because I was thinking of Psalm chapter 1 as we were talking about this, and I was going to bring it up. But there he kind of starts off comparing the two kinds of kings, the two kingdoms, if you will, right? Psalm chapter 1 very clearly sets up Psalm chapter 2, and he's talking about the future king, the king that has been prophesied about, and he kind of sets it up like this king, everything that he does flourishes because of so on and so forth. And then he talks about like the way of life outside of this king, and everything that lifestyle brings is destruction. But it's not destruction that is brought by the one who does what's right. It's destruction that comes consequently by not living under this other form of king. And then I think about like the judgment that God brought in Genesis chapter 3. And his judgment wasn't like dishing out punishment. His judgment was like, this is life outside of my kingdom. These are just natural consequences. You know what I mean? Like, there's going to be pain. You're going to have to provide for yourself because I will not be able to provide for you. Like, all of these things, you know what I mean? So when I think of fear, I don't think of like, oh man, I pray to God I don't mess up today, because he is going to humiliate me. He is going to break me down and make me worship him. I don't think of that at all. I just think of like that brokenness is just naturally going to come from a life outside of his kingdom. So I have a fear of life not under his kingdom.
Yeah, I think biblical fear is such a like. I think it's actually pretty challenging because of exactly what kind of fear. Because for me, there's many times where I think of the fear as like just fear in the face of God, fear in even grasping at his nature, that he created everything, that he has control over everything, that he can hand people over to their destruction to other nations, that he can save you or he can, condemn you in all these ways. Like, there's a lot of scriptures that kind of support that idea of fear, and then there's these passages that support the idea of like everything else that is not God is worth being afraid of. Like, it's fearful of like, dude, what if I go beyond the bounds of this kingdom? What waits for me out there? And it's tough for sure. We could talk about it, a lot. I'm also glad that we're talking about justice. This is I can law degree helping, but justice, exactly what Johnny started saying out, was bringing everybody to even ground. And justice is equity. It's restoring equity.
Yeah.
So like in many cases, part and parcel of that our equity is the punishment of those who have done wrong, sure, but also the reparations of those who have suffered, for those who have lost, and restoring them to the thing. And it's weird because like you think about the legal process and you think about how these civil suits and even some of these criminal suits turn out. It's like, well, you can't give back some of these people who've lost those things. You can't give that back. Why? They just give them money, and people just care about money. It's not a perfect system, but the whole idea of them getting money is like, let's figure out what you lost, and let's try and restore you to that as best as possible. Easiest way for our society is money. We give you monetary value, but the idea isn't to give you money like here's a handout. It's that this money restores you to the state you were before the crime. And this is so important in talking about unity and talking about kingdom and talking about Jesus as a king that you're bringing up, Rodrigo, is that this climate, the social media climate and the political climate, when Christians are calling for justice, if they understood Jesus' justice and justice in general, they're obviously the context that a lot of them are using is like, God brings justice to the wicked. Don't worry about them. God will deliver to them and hand them what they deserve. And unfortunately, there's scriptures that explicitly say that. But really what it is Jesus restoring those who have lost back to to the state before that they had lost. That's justice. It's kind of weird that if we were to talk about justice accurately when we talk on social media, it's like God will bring justice to the people. So let's go and serve all the people and all the communities that were affected by this, and let's make them feel loved and let's bring them up. Like that's what it really is. And there is a biblical, at least I believe, I think there is a biblical aspect of punishment or at least relinquishing to the natural consequences of their actions, like Johnny said. But really, like what Jesus is talking about, that justice, like the main thrust of his point is what you're saying, Rodrigo, that he's bringing justice with a gentle manner. Well, what does that mean? It means he's not necessarily coming to punish all the wrongdoers. He's coming to restore all those who have suffered and all those who are lost and those who are oppressed. And if he's the king, he's the cornerstone of our lives, then that is us. And this is a question that I had asked I think during Unity, but it was like, you know, Jesus is a king of justice and his people should be people of justice. And so then I ask, well, then what kind of justice is the kingdom allowed to bring, right? Because we know that God can condemn, but we're not supposed to condemn. Like there's different, this is the difference you said, Rodrigo, between judging and what was it? Evaluating? Was that what you said?
Yeah, between evaluating and condemning.
Yeah, evaluating. Yeah, those are two different things. But the justice that we can bring is that restorative justice to bring those lowered up. You know what I mean? It's like this is so important to the conversation that we're having that we all just need to get.
Right. You know, let me just read one last thing because I think this sort of summarizes what both of you said really well. This is in Isaiah 29, and just to give context here, like this is looking to a future in which Israel will be destroyed, like Jerusalem, the city, like it's all God is saying like this is gonna go away, people, and you guys are gonna be exiled. But at the same time, he also talks about sort of a restored future, if you will. And Isaiah 29, this part of Isaiah 29 that I'm about to read is sort of like looking to that time. It says, in verse 17, it says, is it not yet very little while until Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be regarded as a forest? In that day, the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. For the ruthless shall come to nothing, and the scoffer cease, and all who watch to do evil shall be cut off. And again, this sort of covers all of your bases here that we were talking about. Is like the coming king and the coming kingdom is looking to a time in which there are people that sort of deserve justice. And the interesting thing is that, like, I come from Mexico, right? And Mexico right now is a mess. But the biggest reason why it's a mess is because the law doesn't stand for the people who are supposed to receive it. Like there are people getting away with all sorts of awful things because the law is no longer working, right? And one of the interesting things is that this is a very natural dynamic of our world, and the people that deserve justice a lot of times don't get it, and the people that don't deserve it end up paying very harshly for that justice not being received. Like in Mexico, again, the example of my country, right? In that example, the justice not being dispensed to people who deserve it, who pays for that? It are the people who are sort of living under this regime of fear and violence because of the cartels, and that's what I'm referring to, right? Who ends up paying for that is the people, the little people, like the poor, the people who live in like these communities that are not necessarily in cities. Like they are sort of living under this wild, wild west kind of environment because the law is not being applied, and so this scripture and really the justice that Jesus was supposed to bring was one in which the blind and the deaf
Right.
and the poor were sort of going to be um, lifted up, if you will, and the people who deserve justice were going to receive it. And this is, I think, part of this discussion of this king, and I think part of what needs to excite us is that is the king that Jesus turned out to be. Like he came and
Right.
he gave sight to the blind, and he sort of stood up and tried to lift up people who were at the very bottom of society. And not that I want to get super political here, but even like the passage, and I think a lot of people misread the passage in John where Jesus is in Martha and Mary's house, and they're about to, they're preparing a meal or some kind of function for Jesus, right? And Martha is at the feet of Jesus listening to him teach, and Mary's all worked up because, like, hey, tell my sister to help me out because she's not helping. And Jesus tells her, like, hey, like, your sister is doing the right thing. Like, she is doing what is best here. And this gets lost on us because we don't necessarily understand that culture. But during Jesus's time, the whole phrase of sitting at someone's feet was the posture that a student took to a teacher. And so literally what Martha is doing is what Mary is doing there is that she's sitting at the feet of Jesus the way that a student would be a teacher. What's amazing about that scene, though, is that women usually did not receive an education, and they usually were not allowed to receive an education. Who went to be taught by rabbis were young boys, right? And in essence, what Jesus is doing in that interaction is that he is giving uh, Mary sort of the right, if you will, to do what she's doing. And that is a radical thing. Like he's basically saying like, hey, this is not doesn't belong just to the man amongst you. Like the woman amongst you can be educated, and they can be educated by the Christ. Like it's not just like some puny teacher over there, like the best teacher that's ever lived. Like that's who that's who can dispense an education for this woman, which again is like it's crazy. Like we don't necessarily think of Jesus as doing stuff like that, but that's the kind of stuff that he did.
Yeah, absolutely. Question. So I think the only real thought I have with this, the kind of thing that maybe I haven't really like been settled on, is God's form of like punishment on the other end or justice on the other end, right? With like, so not his restorative justice, not his like reparative justice, but like his punitive justice.
Right.
And I think when I read those kinds of scriptures, and Nathan said there are plenty of scriptures that show like a punitive side to God's form of judgment. But I honestly wonder how much of that has to do with just how we read into it, but not how it was actually intended, right? Because when you read that passage in Isaiah and you talk about like the evildoers being cut off, like, is that really punitive? Is that really like I'm bringing about, like I'm inflicting like this kind of pain that is going to teach you a lesson? Or is that really consequential? Or is that really like clearly like an evildoer has no place in God's kingdom? Therefore, like you just can't partake in what I have to offer, right? Adam and Eve, they were expelled from the garden because it just automatically, like those two don't go together. You can't be your own king and God still be your king. Like I'm not punishing you to teach you a lesson. You just can't have both. You just can't have, they do not work. You cannot have two kings on the same throne. So therefore, like you have to be in a different place. You have to be separated. But it's not like a punitive action that is being taken.
Well, yes and no, because it's interesting, and this is where I think understanding prophecy sort of comes in handy, because most of the scriptures that we've read, they're all prophecies, right? And for as much as we sort of like to apply prophecy to like the end of time, if you will, particularly in the context of Isaiah, prophecy has a very immediate future.
Right.
And what's interesting about both the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah is that a lot of the subjects of uh, the hammer, let's just call it that way, like the hammer of God, are sort of fall in the category of people who had been warned and didn't listen, right? People who were warned and continue to do really heinous things, which in the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, some of the stuff that they were doing was like sleeping with temple prostitutes at the temple. They were sacrificing children to a foreign god.
Right.
The justice, like for the poor and the weak, was not being handed out correctly. That there was sort of this situation where the rich sort of got away with a bunch of stuff and the poor paid for it, right? And so it is sort of these people, and the last one is kind of like these nations that were coming to conquer Israel. There's this really interesting dynamic in prophecy in which they're both the instrument of God's justice for Israel, but God also sees them as doing something bad. Like they're doing this thing because God is allowing them to do it, right? But at the same time, they're gonna later pay for it for basically uh, oppressing his people.
which is so confusing to me.
It is very confusing, but again, like I think this could turn it completely into another soul side conversation about God's sovereignty, right? Which I don't know that we want to visit that right now, but basically, like all of these people, right? I think when you look at it, to a certain degree, they end up deserving. I don't know that punishment is the right word, but like they say, like you reap what you sow. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
the
Like,
consequences.
right. Like God sends these men to his people to say, like, hey, if you keep doing this, something bad is gonna happen to you. And I think at the end of the day, like God is trying to sort of save us uh from ourselves.
Right.
Because again, like we totally erase the historical context out of a lot of these books, right? And what's interesting about the nation of Judah in particular is that a lot of the warnings were basically against, like, hey, like you keep going down this road, and basically you're gonna reap what you sow. And when you look at the history, like purely the historical record that the Bible provides us, is that the kings, strangely enough, talking about kings, the kings of Judah made really bad decisions economically and in as far as it concerned the nations around them. Like they allied themselves with the wrong people, or they made, like at some point, I forget which king makes a peace treaty with Syria and then breaks it. And I mean, what did you expect? Like Syria, the most powerful like nation in the world, you make a peace treaty with them and then you break it. They're gonna come knock on your door and destroy you. Like that's not. And literally, that's some of the stuff that the prophets were warning Israel about. Like, hey, like continue down this road, and like you are on a path to self-destroying yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And it's interesting because again, if you read Isaiah and Jeremiah along with the book of Kings, First and Second Kings, right? And you see some of the decisions that those kings were making, like you totally see how, like, without changing course, that is totally the path that they were on their way to travel. And so in many ways, like I don't feel like God necessarily causes, like out of nowhere, right? Like you're living your life and you may be doing like one bad thing here or there, and all of a sudden, boom, like, you know, strategy. Like that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who were doing bad things that they were not sort of seeing how bad it was going to get, and God going like, hey, this is going to get really bad if you don't stop. And then it gets bad. And the amazing thing, talking about sort of like God's kindness, right? He lets them travel down that road that is basically the road to doom and the destruction of their country. And all along, he's saying, like, hey, you're going to destroy yourself. You're going to destroy yourself. You're going to destroy yourself. And then they destroy themselves. But who restores them is God. Like, think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, who takes sort of the onus of I'm going to fix this is not people. It is God. And the way that one of the main ways that he does that is I'm gonna send you an amazing king. Like one of the ways in which we're gonna fix this mess is that like, clearly you do not have good kings. I'm going to send you the perfect king. And that guy is gonna fix everything.
Yeah. A question for you, Johnny. Well, I guess you too, Alberto. With this idea of like punishment, the punitive justice, does God really cause that, or is it natural consequences? And not to belabor the point, do you think the with great power comes great responsibility argument has any meaning here?
How so? What do you mean?
In the sense that, well, actually, Tom Holland Spider-Man puts it the best of like when you have the ability to do something and you don't, that's on you. So do you think that does not apply with God?
So you're saying like God has the power to like put a stop to something, and if he doesn't, then it's on him?
Yeah, so then would that then fall under
But
the
I think
umbrella
he
of
is
God
doing
causing?
something. But I think he is doing something, which is what Rodrigo said. He's warning. He's constantly warning. He's not like he's idle and not doing anything.
Mhm.
You know, he may not be like putting a stop to it, you know, by like sending people to jail or straight up killing people necessarily, but he's just trying to stop it by warning before it even gets there.
Well, last question then, of what would then separate God from prophets, or God from the anointed godly men who will also warn people, although a lot of it was like God speaking through them, who will also warn people.
Right.
But if it comes down to it, that one person can't stop a nation, whereas God can't. You still think same thing, just as a matter of curiosity, not challenging.
So what's the difference between God and the prophets is what you're asking?
Yeah, because if God intervening is him warning, which is the same thing as a prophet warning or a king warning or a godly person anointed warning, you know, what would be the difference between them? I mean, we still think that God could actually intervene and just like snap a nation out of existence, but a prophet can't.
Yeah, but I don't think that's how God chooses to work.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I was just wondering
It's interesting because you say that, and in a more elaborate way, that's what he did. Because think about this, right? And this is a pattern. This is a pattern that exists all throughout the Old Testament, right?
Mhm.
And my departing point with this is always the story of Noah. Because Noah is a really interesting story to me because the only detail that we have for how bad things were during Noah's time is that Genesis basically says that the earth was filled with violence, right? Like
Mhm.
things were so bad that the earth was filled with violence.
Right.
And it's interesting because even a few years ago, I happened upon this article this guy wrote in this TED talk that he did. I don't know if it was a TED talk; it was something else. But basically, this guy was talking about how uh, literally billions of dollars since the 80s has been poured into developing countries to help them not be developing countries anymore, right? And like literally billions of dollars from all over the world has been poured into these poorer countries to help them come out of poverty. And in reasonable thinking, you should think like that's gonna fix it.
Right.
And the reality is that it's fixed it for a lot of people. Like the people even in developing countries are wealthier today than they were like 30 years ago. But the places where they're not, the one of the biggest reasons why they're not is not because of lack of resources. It is because of violence, right? Like if people cannot, for example, go to school because they fear being kidnapped or shot on their way to school, like violence is literally limiting progress in many ways. If there are no laws, for example, in Tanzania right now, right, which is an African country, for those of you who are not very familiar with geography, there is no law protecting widows. So if you're married and you die and your husband dies, uh, what was your husband's does not automatically belong to you. And so what happens is a lot of times the families of those husbands who die come and take everything away from the wives, like even if they have children or whatever. And so in some ways, right, like well, that was a big tangent that was going somewhere. The story of Noah. Sorry. So what God ends up doing in a time filled with violence is that he literally wipes everybody out and sort of starts over. And when you look at sort of how the story of the destruction of Israel is told, it's told the same way. Like he basically there's all this wickedness in within his people, right? And he's going to allow for those people to be destroyed, and he's going to keep a remnant through which he is going to rebuild his nation. And so, in some way, not in a Thanos kind of way where he's just snapping his finger and boom,
Right.
like all these people are disappearing, but in some way, like he is like super hands on. He's just not doing it at the speed necessarily that we would like it to. But in many ways, the destruction of Israel is God pressing the reset button on his nation to say like, like this is not that it's unsavable because he saved it, but with this group of people this is not going to go, this is not going to work. And so I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to let them suffer in a sense. And again, like I think for some of you who may be listening to this is like, that's cruel.
Yeah.
Again, some of these people were horrible people. Like, they were doing horrible things. And in some ways, what they reaped was what they were sowing. And so God is allowing them to come to their own doom, right? So that he can keep the people who weren't necessarily bad and sort of rebuild everything with them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, in this. Oh, sorry,
Go
Betsy.
ahead.
Yeah, no,
45 minutes.
I just want to elaborate on your point there, because I think it's very easy for us to read some of these things, particularly in the Old Testament, and just be like, what? That's crazy. Like, God just, brought down fire on these people. And we can think like, can feel like, oh, that God was so different back then. And I think miss out on some really deep, important things. I think in terms of judgment and justice, like, I'm grateful that God is not a pushover God. Like,
Yeah.
when things get so evil, and I think that's key to this, when we're talking about before Noah and the flood, I think about Pharaoh, I think about Babylon, I think about Rome. Like, there's just like some immense evil that I'm grateful that there's a God that it's in his nature to not take that lightly. Now, there's a level of wisdom and understanding that God has that is far beyond us. So, like,
Exactly.
there's going to be times where we see examples where, he kind of did the, so to speak, snap of his fingers. There's other times where he lets it go by. I think what's clear, or not go by, maybe that's not the right word, but he doesn't snap the fingers when
He allows people to kind of destroy themselves.
when we would hope he would. I think what has to be clear is that he is a God of justice, and the story's not over. And I think there is I like what we were reading here in Isaiah 42, like that slowness, which, I think it's hard for us to be okay with, because it's like, oh, it's so clear, just put these guys in jail. But I think God is like restoring humanity. And I think if he administered justice like we did, where we just, think about the United States of America, we put a bunch of people in prisons. How restorative has that been for our country?
Right.
Like, are there less drugs? Is there less crime? Are we any safer because we have a bunch of people in prison? So, like, there's a lot of just like trust that has to go in there. But kind of bringing it back to a king, and Rodrigo, you brought up Mary and Martha, and this idea of her being at Jesus' feet to learn from him. And so what's powerful and maybe tough to like grasp about the kingdom is, like, we see these scriptures in the prophets of like restoration and like bringing down the oppressor, and like really a sense of like battle that's going to happen, and they're going to get what's due to them.
Yep.
But then you come to something like Sermon on the Mount, and you see some of the weapons that Jesus is offering. And one of the first ones is, it's told to you to not murder, but I'm telling you, do not be angry. Do not be contemptuous. Do not call someone a fool. Like, before anyone could ever wage war on someone, before anyone could shoot a gun at someone and commit murder, before that, they were angry. And they had a sense of like vengeance towards another person. And Jesus is coming. He's saying, when the kingdom has engulfed you, when your heart has just transformed, I'm telling you that not even in your heart will you feel this kind of vengeance and anger for someone else. And in that sense, like that weapon has dismantled the oppressor.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you think about that person was oppressing before, but here's Jesus bringing reign into his life, that oppressor's life, and that oppressor's now like I can't remember how the plowshares are being like bent. Do you know what I'm talking about? That's like
Oh yes, the plowshares. I know it 12.
I think it's Isaiah 40 if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, like basically the tools that were used previously for violence and
Yeah,
suppression.
swords are turning to plows, is what it is.
Yes. That those same tools for violence, for oppression are being dismantled.
Yeah.
That's really well said, dude. Rodrigo, I did want to say, like, yeah, I think the way you explained it, Beto, is just done in a really, really helpful way. The reason why I keep harping on this is because I think the narrative can so easily turn about God being a king who is very punitive in how he brings his justice. Right. And I think a lot of people do view God like, how many times have you heard people say, like, why would a loving God
right.
like
exactly
send people to hell to burn for eternity? And it's like, it's viewed in this very, like, he's there to punish. He's like, just because you don't accept him as your Lord and Savior, I have to burn in hell. Like, that makes no sense. That's not equal punishment. But I think people are just viewing it from a lens that's just not correct. Like, you're not understanding the God's form of judgment all throughout history. And like, so many of those, punishments that we've seen, like you said, Rodrigo, it was much more about salvation than anything else. He was trying to prevent like a cancer from further spreading. He was really trying to save creation in the Noah story, in the Israel story, by keeping the Israelites in the desert until they're all gone, so that he can establish a kingdom that was actually going to be everlasting.
Right.
I just think all of that changes, and it goes from like, I am terrified of this God, I really don't want to do what's wrong, to like, no, I really appreciate this God. Like, thank goodness he is here as my king, directing me. I just think it changes completely our posture towards him.
Yeah, and let me just say real quickly. So it's Isaiah 2:4, because I just butchered it so terribly. And he will judge between the nations and will decide concerning many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks.
Yeah. So, Johnny, you just made me think of something that I really wanted to get to, because I think this is super important and very much pertaining to our discussion here. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make with Jesus, but particularly with Jesus being sort of the king of our lives, right, is this idea that like Jesus came to give us a life that is best in its future. And what I mean by that is like, yeah, like Jesus came to save us, right? And we're going to be in heaven with him, but that's it. When in reality, talking about, again, sort of like God saving us from ourselves,
right.
Part of what Jesus came to do as well is to sort of set the parameters of a good life kingdom. And what I mean by that is like the life that Jesus wants us to live, and we've all alluded to this up until now. The life that Jesus wants us to live in, the one that he came to give us, is a good one.
Yeah.
Right. And again, like I think like we sort of a lot of times the way that we portray Christianity is like, hey, you become a Christian and now like this awesome life that you're gonna live is like when you die and when like
oh yeah,
right. But that's a lot of like when you think about times where Jesus said like, hey, I came to give you life, and the NIV says I came to give it to you to the full, which is not I don't know what even that means. Literally what Jesus says, I came to give you an abundant life, like a plentiful, not abundant in the monetary sense, but like a rich
quality,
a rich
Yeah.
quality life, exactly. And so that's what he came to do. And so this idea that somehow like the life that Jesus came to give us through his death and how he was crowned king and all that stuff, like the best existence of that life is like down the line where we can't see it. Like that's not, and I say all that to say is that Jesus is king for us now. Like
Hmm.
the life that we're supposed to live under his kingdom and by his teachings and from his character is supposed to be an awesome kingdom now. Like
Yeah.
it's a now life as opposed to like a later life. Um
Hmm.
and so even
Yeah.
again having this whole conversation about God being punitive, it's not so much, and again, I don't want to continue to restate it. And even in that sense, like Jesus is king of our lives, and it's supposed to be a good life. And ultimately, like what people are losing out by not living life under that kingdom is a good life. You know, we were talking about. I work at a school, and we were talking about how uh, how much my
Your
students
religion.
like me.
Yeah.
But part of the reason why I've built a good rapport with my students is because I'm really forthcoming as to the life that I've lived. And just the other day, man, like I was telling them that I lived like a really wild and crazy teenage life. Like when I was their age, I did a lot of stuff. And like the first time that I got like passed out drunk was when I was 13 years old.
Oof.
And when I was 16, I had a 22-year-old girlfriend. And so, like, I did some stuff that was crazy, man. And like between the time that I was 13 to the time when that I was 19, which is when I became a Christian, right? I did a lot of crazy stuff. And it's interesting because part of, and I think people talk about this all the time, is like part of the reason why I turned to God is because I looked at my life and I was like, you know what? I am no longer enjoying this. Like, this is no longer like what I would consider an enjoyable life. And I was like, something's got to give. Like something needs to change. And again, I feel like my life under God, under this King, has been so much richer in every possible way. Like, and I say this saying that when I was before I was a Christian, I had amazing friends, like friends who were loyal and friends who had my back and friends that I had a lot of like fun with, right? But I've had so much more better friends than I had before I was a Christian. Like I friends that I know aren't just there for fun and the hard times, but friends that are there for wisdom, friends that are there for like stuff that is really uncomfortable, like friends that are there to like lift up, literally lift up and transform my spirit, right? And again, I say that saying that I had really good friends before I was a Christian, friends that up to this day I'm still friends with, right? But the quality of friendship that I have in the kingdom of God, and I think that the relationship amongst the four of us is very much a testament to that, is like 100 times better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And again, all this to say that like this life and of having a king who's an amazing king, who's a justice bearing, gentle king is ultimately an amazing life. You know what I mean? Like I think the
Yeah.
whole concept of having a king, because most of the kings that we can refer to in our minds are super tyrannical, is not necessarily something that appeals to us constantly, right? But like that's not the king that Jesus is. That is not the king that he came to be. Uh, You know, one of the things that I also want to talk about is sort of the dynamic that Jesus brought into the kingdom. It was from the get-go supposed to be very different than the dynamic of other kings.
Yeah.
In the book of Deuteronomy, as the Israelites are entering the promised land, one of the things that he tells them is like, hey, if you want a king, let me tell you what kind of king I want you to appoint yourselves over. And what he talks about is that he doesn't want a violent king, not a king that's going to come and take their daughters as into his palace, not a king that's going to gather horses and chariots for war, right? A king who's going to have at the forefront of his mind the word of God and God's presence, right? So he basically tells them, like, before the nation of Israel starts, it's like, hey, if you're ever going to have a king, I want you to basically have a completely different king than the kings that you know of, because success as a king was measured in chariots and horses and women in your palace, and basically on how firm of a hand you had over your people. And
Yeah.
what God tells the people of Israel is like, hey, the king that you want is completely the opposite than all of the kings that you have ever known. And so that's the other thing. Like, Jesus came to be an upside down king in every possible way,
Yeah.
both in the things that he was bringing, but also in the ways, in the sort of what's the way the word I'm in the mannerisms and the ritual of kings. He basically came to be an upside down king.
Yeah. Yeah. I love first of all that you're previously talking about kingdom now and this life now, and because which I think is appropriate because, well, one, we often think of, oh, it's just like, all right, I converted and it, it's just about once I make it to heaven, whenever that time comes, and not much is important from now until then. But which we could talk a lot about that. I think what is limiting about that is it's not very practical for me. But what do I do in the meantime? How should I act in the meantime? How am I supposed to be in the meantime? Does that matter at all? And so I think as we're discussing, what's that?
You pass out church invitations.
Obviously. And then you follow the Bible study series.
But yeah, I mean, I think speaking about, what we do in our life now is a natural transition as we're talking about the coming of the King. What does it mean for our life? And I lost my train of thought.
Yes, I would too.
I know. What were you just talking about?
It's not a future kingdom; it's a now kingdom.
Heaven now, kind of a thing.
Right.
No,
Jesus is upside down.
Upside
Yeah.
down.
Okay. Yes. Perfect.
There it is.
So step one or point one of what I'm trying to make is like, it's a now, like, your active life everyday now thing. And so then we can start to draw parallels between kingdoms we see in the Bible to kingdoms we see today. Even what you just said about, like, what was, like, considered as good status for a king, or how a king was measured, the chariots, the women, like, how oppressive and powerful they were. I can find all those parallels today.
Yeah. Mm.
Yes.
Yeah.
There is plenty of examples that I can find of power, of women driven, of money, whatever. Like, those kingdoms are oppressing us today. And when we're under their reign, we're not human. There's like, we're not functioning the way we're meant to be. But like, when we are in line with what Jesus is talking about, we come to this like epiphany moment of like feeling fully human, feeling fully exactly like when we talk about church, like a community, people who love one another, like those are some of the greatest joys, like being able to lay your life down for others and serve them. Like when we do these things that are upside down in terms of what we're used to, but they're actually the Jesus is just turning back around what we had put upside down, really, just putting it on its right, the way it's meant to be in the first place.
Yeah, dude. It's like, I mean, what the chariots and the women in the palace and like that kind of power, all it signified to people was like, that's what it means to like live life to the full. That's how you get the most out of life. That's the good life, right? Like the way John Mark Comer and Mark Sayers talk about like what the good life is. And I love how you paralleled it to what we're going through now, right? Like we look at social media and technology as like, this is what provides us like the good life, the satisfying life, money, women, and, you know, sex, all these things. We look at that. It's like, that's what brings about the most enjoyment. You know, I only live once. Like, let me make the most of it. Like, let me think about all the places I can travel and like just experience like the deepest pleasures that this world has to offer. But I love how, man, it brings it back to what you first mentioned early on in this conversation, Beto. Is like something's going to rule you, something's going to like control you. And man, I see it all the time. I've seen it in my own life, even while under the quote unquote kingdom, like, right, I'm in the church, I'm a disciple of Christ. I can still live life under the rule of other things, right? Like whether it be the internet and like technology and things that just completely consume my thinking and how I live, like the things that I devote my time to, the things that totally influence the way that I think. Therefore, that's how I end up acting, right? Like I can so easily be influenced by like all the news and the politics and all this stuff. And that's how I start to view other people and treat other people. And that's how I start to live my life. And without even realizing it, I think I'm in the pursuit of like, what's the good life? You know what I mean? But that stuff is totally breaking me down. It's causing a disruption in my marriage at times because I can so be consumed by other things or in relationships, or I can miss out on the things that are truly fulfilling, not only to me, but like just to the man, just the real estate around me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think you get to it that it's hard. It's like, it's not just you make a decision like there's a decision you make to maybe convert to be a Christian, and then you're discipling under Jesus, so I love these images of people at Jesus's feet, because it's like it's the most just like submissive expression
Humble.
of just like, you've got what I've been looking for, and I'm just gonna sit at your feet so that I can like get to the fullness of what you are and who you are.
Yeah,
that's what we do when the kingdom is here and now. That's been so empowering for me, because if the kingdom is here now, then that means every day is another opportunity to draw even closer and to learn even more from Jesus. Like, show me how to do this life, because when I do it on my own, it doesn't go too well.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of brings, sorry, Rodrigo.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is that this kind of what you're talking about, Beto, kind of brings up another component of Jesus's like way of like doing, like being a king that we haven't addressed, which he, like when Jesus came, he wasn't just being the king, like God is the king, but he was being the king that the kings that we're meant to be, right? Like the rulers that he created to rule over all of the earth, right? Like the kings and queens that we're meant to be. Like that's kind of who he was also. So he plays like a dual role, where he's both the king and then like the sub king. So he also kind of sets the example for us. Like this is what it looks like when we are the kings that he exemplifies, right? And I look at Jesus's life, and he's still trapped in this broken world where there's a lot of pain. Like no one will look at Jesus' life and be like, man, he lived the perfect life. Nothing. No. He suffered more than anybody. He was strapped. But look at how he dealt with what he dealt with. Like, how do you go through what he went through with the mental and emotional fortitude, right? With like the kind of peace that he went through. Like you look at everybody around him, the fear that they had when they faced opposition. But Jesus is like a rock, man. You know, like he was able to go through the most grueling of like scenarios because he lived the life of the king that he was meant to live. You know what I mean? Being connected to the vine, if you will, like being Psalm 1, like being connected to that stream that is God's wisdom, like that just allowed him to act the way he was created to. And that allowed his life to flourish in a way that no other life was able to flourish. So I don't only view Jesus's way of ruling as like, I'm meant to obey him, but I'm also meant to rule like he ruled.
Yes. You know, dude, I was just about to say something pertaining to that, and I'm glad because I'm going to get to say it in fewer words.
Perfect.
You know, I have been mesmerized, not in a good sense, mesmerizing that I've been putting a lot of attention into this because the past 4 years in this country have been really puzzling to me, particularly not from a world perspective because the world is crazy, but from Christians specifically. And again, this is I'm not just off the bat. I'm not trying to say anything about Donald Trump whatsoever. I'm literally right now. I'm talking to Christians in general because this what you just said to me is key, and this is actually one of the things that I really wanted to talk about during this time. One of the things that we saw early on over this time that we've been talking is how the king uh, basically dictates the kingdom. Like how the king is how the kingdom is going to be, and in turn, how the people of that kingdom are supposed to be. And I love what you said that he is in essence the king that we are supposed to be as kings as well. Like whether we realize it or not, we also get to rule over things.
Yeah.
Like as a
Right.
father, I rule over my children. Uh, I rule over my wife, although I understand the equality thing. I'm not saying I don't
She rules over you too.
rule over her, but
Okay, Johnny. Jeez. Give it a rest.
but we all at some point in our lives we're all going to be over something, right?
Right.
And how we rule over those things says a lot about who is our king and what king we're looking up uh to be our king. And all that being said, the past 4 years have been really mesmerizing to me because we are sort of encountering a point in our society in which Christian influence is diminishing more and more.
Hmm.
And some people would argue that that is the worst thing that could ever happen in the world. I don't necessarily agree, but more than anything, what has puzzled me is the way that people have reacted to that, which is basically like we are going to try to uh, regain this power, right? By very political means and
Right.
by basically putting our guy or the guy that we back in charge of things. Never mind that this guy is, in many ways, uh, I mean, I'm not going to mince words here, immoral, arrogant, uh, like all kinds of things, right? Um, at times mean, although people would think, oh, it's mean. Like, read your Bible. Being mean is not a good thing. It's not a moral.
Read your Bible.
Yes.
Being mean is
Yeah.
not a good thing.
It's not.
Don't be mean, guys.
Yeah, turn that into a soundbite, please.
Freaking stupid.
So, but again, to me, it's kind of like we try to find the answers in all of these things,
Mhm.
even in the face of this may not be the most Jesus-like thing that you could do, right? And to me, the answer is being like the king.
Right.
And we talked about this last time. Like, imagine again how much more willing people would be to listen to Christians if what we were known for was our kindness or our forgiveness or our uh,
Yeah.
desire to want to help the poor, as opposed to, hey, we want to back this politician or this political party.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or like, hey, like, I don't know. I can think of 100 examples, but ultimately, to me, is like so many times because we don't understand that the kingdom is here and the king is here and we're supposed to be like the king and Jesus is the kind of king that we're supposed to be. We lose out on what could be the most powerful statement of our faith, which is our lives. And man, like I just feel like in so many ways we have not really begun, and I say we, I mean the Christian church, we have not really begun to tap into that
Yeah.
to
Right.
sort of gain in many ways the influence that we're losing. It's almost like
Yep.
yes, we are losing this influence, and again, we're the means by which we're trying to regain it. At times, does not necessarily seem completely Christ-like, and then in turn, we're surprised when people go like, "Oh yeah, well, even like we want to listen to you even less," and so like
Mhm.
again, like we're losing sort of this opportunity to really live lives that are upside down, that are like not typical, and losing on the opportunity to for that to have the impact it's supposed to have, for people to then for us to be able to influence the world and people around us.
Yeah, I've said it 10 times now, and I'll keep saying it. It's just like when you say upside down, that Jesus lived in upside down, it's like upside down, radical. Like you don't even use what Alberto said, you don't even use the same weapons that other people use. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I get it. I get the trap. I get the of like, we're such a connected world. The world is smaller than it's ever been. Like these are the tools that society is using. We need to represent Jesus using those tools, which is different from like representing Jesus in those communities. Rodrigo talked to us about like the internet is a community. We need to represent Jesus. That's one thing. But using the same tools as them, like you just imagine if Jesus, you put Jesus in front of, you know, many people, they will, no matter what, they're going to understand what he's saying. It's just how they react. So they'll either react with like, okay, this is awesome, I love it. Or they'll be like, yeah, this is all true, but I hate it. And so now I'm just going to try and shut you down. You think about Jesus, you don't think he couldn't reach out to any number of leaders, rulers, lords, kings, and through that, if by changing their heart, they change their communities and like it impacts everything. You don't think that Jesus could have done that? You don't think that God had thought about that? He was upside down. He literally said, no, we're not going to go to the kings. I'm going to start with 12 guys. And each of those guys are going to make more guys. He elected, I don't know if it was elected, I don't know if it was planned, but verbiage, he elected to leave because it was better off. And we're sitting here and we're thinking about all the tools that make sense. It makes sense. If I have this platform, I can reach so many more people with my faith and all these things. It's so upside down that this thing that doesn't make sense works because God is real, and we put him in this box, and we continue to put him in this box. Like even if you think about the fact that God can make the decision to sacrifice many to save the few, or to let people suffer so that they might be redeemed and rejuvenated in the future. We think about that moral conundrum in lots of like entertainment media, right? Thanos, like that whole idea when we think of leaders of countries like, all right, we're just going to let this country die, and like, you know, this and this and that. It doesn't make sense for them because they don't know everything. But with God, you cannot apply the same logic. We could put God in this box. So like he knows everything. And so his decision is for sure 100% the right way to go. And if he could do it any other way, he literally would. He totally would, because that's his nature. So it's like, it's so upside down that it's like if we go and we love and we live out kingdom now, today, as opposed to like hinging our bets. Now, I'm not as strong and passionate about it as you guys. I do believe as we continue to elect leaders and we continue to implement laws that move further and further away from Christian values, I think it makes the job harder, in my personal opinion. Johnny's helped me understand that society is cyclical. So even though that it might get harder and there might be this like moral decay, it always bounces back. And apparently that's a thing. But still, it's like it's approaching everything upside down, that if we go to our neighborhoods, we don't feel like we changed the world. But we changed the world if we really did that. We like it's that's how it's designed to work. It's designed to work in a way that the world isn't expecting it to work.
Yeah, I think that when you talk about the 12 guys, that's how he decided to do it. That's just, there's so much there, so much depth there.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
But I think it's because it hits at the point that like when someone gets transformed from deeply within, like we see those disciples, we see people like Peter just become like night and day kind of person, and that seed has grown in them. Like it's just like something is unleashed that is still available to us. And Rodrigo, to your point of like kind of where maybe mainstream Christianity has gone these days, where I think in one respects it's alarming because the image of Christianity is getting destroyed and hurt by what most people typically see. I think for me, with that, I see opportunity to like bring such a refreshing
Yeah.
message to people. I think it will be hard to like break through these walls and barriers that have been built because of, you know, other things that have happened. But I think when people see like, oh, this is Christianity, this is what we're talking about, like this is the message, like it's that when you really understood it, it like it transforms in a way that you couldn't have imagined before.
You know, you are let me just throw this analogy out, and then we'll close out here, because this I started off being fired up about this episode, and I'm leaving more fired up than I began, because this has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah.
But let me just close with this, because I think you have hit on something that is totally on point. And I've had this conversation with other people, and out of everything that I've talked about the kingdom, this is what excites me the most. We're a humble operation here, right?
Right.
And you know, the plan is for it to be a not so humble operation. For people who are listening to us, I am glad that we have a small audience right now, because big change starts with a small group of people.
Yeah.
That is an irrefutable law of change, is that big change starts with a small group of people. And for everybody that's listening, let me just say this. Again, appealing to my Mexicanness. The Mexican food that you eat in this country is not Mexican food.
Okay.
It's not. All right? I went my entire youth up until I was 16 years old living in Mexico, in and out, right? Never once did I have a burrito. All right? Let me just say that. But I say that to say that the what people think Mexican food is in this country is not, in fact, authentic Mexican food, which then opens the door for me to actually open people's eyes and give them a plate of food and go like, this is actual Mexican food.
Oh my
Then they taste it and they go like, oh, this is amazing. And I'm like, yes, it is. And it's the real stuff.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way with what many people consider Christianity is, right? Now, some people will never, and this has happened to me. Some people will just go like, no, I like my Mexican food. Don't give me the real stuff. I want this fake stuff. This is what I like. Cool. Like, lost to you, my friend. All right. But we have such a great opportunity to bring the real thing to people. Like, I feel like at this point in time, like, the world is thirsty for, and they don't even know it. The world is thirsty for real Jesus King Christianity.
Yeah.
To be present, right? And in many ways, like, I do feel like the fields are ripe.
Right.
Yeah.
People who are legitimate kingdom dwellers who want to live the life the king wants them to live. The fields are ripe for those people to come along and like shine and be like, oh, this is different. Why are you so different? Why are you so humble? Why are you so kind? Why are you so forgiving? Why are you so giving? Why do you serve so much? Well, let me tell you, I have a king, and that king is upside down, and I'm upside down, and I don't follow the same power structures, and I don't think all these things are as cool as you think they are. And we can sit down and have a conversation about it if you want, because I would love to, because I want to introduce you to my king, right? And like, again, like, we have such a good opportunity to sort of like bring this legitimate
Right.
Jesus is the king of my life to people. And I think if we make a concerted effort to really live that life and to really live it out and be weird and be upside down and live as the people of a foreign kingdom, like, we have the opportunity to make such a great impact in the world. And the world needs it. Like, they need it. Like, people need this stuff, man. Like, they do. You know, like, it's amazing to me, sort of like all the different stations that we visited through this conversation, and they've all been completely appropriate. because for Jesus to be king, all of those things sort of like have to exist. Like the concept of justice and the concept of like him being upside down and what does it mean for our lives? All of those things. Like this has been again, I've enjoyed every podcast we've made, and I feel like, but this one, like, because again, I was super fired up about talking about this because I feel like we don't talk about it enough. And even again, some of the stations that we visited, I wasn't ready to visit those stations. Like I didn't think we were gonna go there. And then we got there, and I'm like, man, this is even more awesome. And so I say all that to say thank you guys. This has been amazing. I think this may need a part 2 because we didn't get to the things that I wanted to talk about, and I'm glad that we didn't because this ended up being awesome. But I do think that there's a few more things with the whole upside down concept that I do really think would be good to visit, because I think we need to talk more about the sort of like upside down dynamics that we're supposed to live under, because those are really important both for the church and for the people around us. And so there will be a part 2 to this whole conversation, and then we'll continue our Kingdom series. And thank you so much for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, vehemently disagree with us, or if you want to just encourage you by how much you were, pumping your fist as we were talking about stuff, please get in touch with us through social media at EtherMMC. If you have any issues with anything that I personally said, you can find me at Rodrigo Ether, either on Twitter or on Instagram, and I will be happy to have a conversation about your disagreements. And thank you so much for listening, and go in peace. We'll catch you on the next one. Dude, that was awesome. You guys brought it today.
We got the freaking boys, the squad.
Let's go.